Victoria Ashbourne tore the warning report in half right in front of the board, then dropped the pieces onto the dusty boots of Nolan Reed. To her, he was nothing more than a single father working a contract inspection job. A man trying to manufacture a crisis out of a few hairline shifts on an $800 million bridge. Nolan did not argue. He looked at his watch and said they had less than 1 hour. The room laughed. 58 minutes later, Victoria's phone rang. The governor had ordered a full lockdown of the Ashbourne Crown Bridge. If watching the powerful answer for their arrogance is exactly the kind of story you came here for, hit subscribe and stay for every detail. The morning of the Ashbourne Crown Bridge dedication had been years in the making. A ceremony meant to define not just a structure, but a dynasty. The bridge stretched across Hudson Ridge in gleaming steel cables and smooth concrete, a project worth $800 million that had consumed 4 years of planning, political maneuvering, and construction. Hundreds of guests filled the staging area below the main span. Investors in pressed suits, journalists adjusting camera angles, civic officials rehearsing remarks they had polished for weeks. On the platform above the river, the Ashbourne family crest was projected larger than the state seal, a quiet but unmistakable declaration of whose victory this day belonged to. Music played through outdoor speakers, a catered breakfast was laid out across white-draped tables, and the first convoy of vehicles waited behind a ceremonial ribbon less than half a mile away. Nolan Reed was not standing on the platform. He was crouched near the base of the eastern anchor cluster, working methodically through his checklist before the opening convoy rolled. His truck sat on a service road nearby, an older model with dried concrete on the wheel wells and a windshield cracked near the lower corner. His boots were the kind that never quite came clean no matter how long he scrubbed them. He had been hired 3 weeks earlier through a state contracting office to run a standard pre-event safety review, a formality most engineers treated as paperwork. Nolan did not treat it as paperwork. He ran the inspection the same way he had run every inspection for the past 2 decades, carefully, without shortcuts, and without assumptions about what the previous team had already confirmed. He found the first anomaly when he pressed his vibration sensor against the eastern cable bundle. The frequency reading was lower than the design specification, not drastically but consistently, across 3 separate cable groups. A single low reading could be dismissed as instrument noise or thermal effect. 3 in a cluster was a pattern. He noted it and moved on, crouching lower to examine the anchor plate where the cables terminated into the concrete. A thin alignment mark scratched on the plate during installation was offset by several millimeters from the reference line. The plate had shifted. He pulled out his flashlight and checked the lot codes stamped into the bearing rods above the anchor socket, then cross-referenced them against the approved materials schedule on his tablet. The codes did not match. The rods installed in the eastern cluster carried markings from a supplier that did not appear anywhere in the approved vendor list. Taken individually, any one of these irregularities could have been explained away. Taken together, they described a cable anchor system bearing load unevenly across components of uncertain quality. Nolan completed his field notes and requested an immediate meeting with the project's lead engineer. The site manager who relayed the request looked at him the way one might look at a person who had stopped traffic to rescue a leaf. He was told that senior staff were occupied with media preparation and that the ceremony would begin in under 2 hours. Nolan submitted a formal urgent notice anyway, flagging the eastern anchor cluster as requiring ultrasonic testing before any vehicle load was applied, and marking his classification at the top of the form, chain slip risk. As he filed the notice, he noticed the alignment mark on the anchor plate had moved again, a fraction further from the reference line, even though no weight had yet rolled across the bridge. He was escorted into a conference room beneath the stage, where the real decision-making of the morning was underway. Victoria Ashbourne sat at the head of the table surrounded by board members, Governor Elias Whitmore's deputy, and a row of investors who had flown in specifically for this event. Preston Kincaid occupied the chair to her left, with a stack of bound reports in front of him and the practiced ease of someone who had testified before legislative committees many times. The room smelled of coffee and ambition, and nobody in it looked like they wanted to hear what Nolan Reed had to say. Preston took the report from Nolan's hand, flipped through it at a speed that made reading impossible, and set it on the table with a soft but deliberate sound. He announced that the deviations Nolan had flagged were consistent with standard thermal expansion behavior for a structure of this size on a warm morning. He cited, without producing the source, 3 peer-reviewed studies he claimed supported this interpretation, and his tone was the tone of a man explaining arithmetic to someone who had never seen numbers before. Nolan let him finish, then asked him to identify which thermal model would simultaneously account for a frequency drop across a cable cluster, a lateral shift in an anchor plate, and a mismatch in material lot codes, since no such model existed in any literature he was aware of. Preston did not answer the question. He asked Nolan how long he had been working on this project. Victoria took her cue from that. When she learned that Nolan's contract covered surface-level inspection for 3 weeks, her posture shifted in a way that required no elaboration. Preston went further, noting with the air of someone being helpful, rather than cruel, that he understood Nolan was raising his daughter alone, and that the financial pressures of contract work were real. The implication did not require spelling out. Nolan did not respond to that. He explained calmly that by the time the first vehicle convoy reached the midspan at midday temperatures, the thermal load combined with vehicle weight would accelerate the anchor plate displacement beyond what the surrounding concrete could absorb through friction alone. He estimated that their window to halt traffic and request an emergency structural review was less than 1 hour from that moment. Victoria looked at him for a long beat. Then she told him he had chosen the most important day in her company's history to make a threat. She picked up the warning report. She tore it in half. She let the pieces fall onto the floor in front of his boots and told him his contract was terminated effective immediately. Nolan did not reach down for the pieces. He told her, in the same even tone he had used throughout, that he had already uploaded the full report to the state safety server before walking into that room. The silence that followed lasted 2 seconds before Preston assured the board that no regulatory agency would shut down an $800 million bridge based on the report of a dismissed inspector. His access badge was deactivated before he reached the gate. A site security officer walked him to the perimeter and waited while he crossed to the service road. Nolan sat in the cab of his truck, opened his laptop, and continued working. He had already sent the state server a time-stamped copy of his raw sensor data, but the data alone meant nothing if nobody at the state level acted on it. He pulled up the direct contact for Dana Pike, Director of Construction Safety at the State Department of Transportation, and wrote her a concise message with 3 attached files: the sensor logs, the lot code discrepancy table, and a photograph of the anchor plate alignment mark in its shifted position. Dana called him 11 minutes later. She did not introduce herself with warmth. She said she had the files in front of her, but that the bridge's own monitoring dashboard was showing all systems within normal parameters, and she needed him to explain the discrepancy. Nolan told her to request the raw sensor feed from the state server before it was filtered through the bridge's control interface, because the control interface was operated by Ashbourne infrastructure and its display thresholds had been altered. Dana put him on hold. When she came back, her voice had changed. The unfiltered data stream showed a pattern of small, regular oscillations in the eastern anchor zone that did not appear on the company dashboard at all. She asked him what he thought was causing it. He told her uneven load distribution across components of different elastic quality, likely due to a material substitution in the anchor rods. On the bridge platform, Preston stepped up to a microphone and told the assembled press that the Ashbourne Crown had been subjected to the most rigorous inspection protocol in the state's infrastructure history. The crowd applauded. Victoria stood behind him, composed and precise, wearing the expression of a person who had already won. The first convoy vehicles had begun their slow advance toward the bridge approach, and Nolan watched their progress on a traffic feed on his laptop screen while keeping his phone pressed to his ear. Dana deployed a patrol unit to install temporary barriers at the eastern approach, but the convoy had already rounded the final curve before the access road, and the officers were still a quarter-mile out. Nolan stayed on the line with her, walking her through the oscillation data point by point. At minute 58, the state's independent sensor cluster mounted under the eastern expansion joint registered a new displacement event, measurably larger than the ones before it, consistent with the anchor plate continuing its lateral drift under thermal load. Dana did not wait. She forwarded the data package directly to Governor Whitmore's office with a single-sentence cover note. Victoria's phone rang while she was shaking hands with the deputy governor and preparing to walk toward the ribbon. The call lasted under 40 seconds. When she lowered the phone, the ceremony coordinator was already being told to stop the convoy, and state patrol units were moving to seal both bridge approaches. The barriers went up in front of hundreds of journalists. The ribbon hung uncut. The people who had been laughing in the conference room an hour earlier now stood very still, watching Victoria Ashbourne stare at nothing in particular, while her phone continued to ring with calls she was not answering. Victoria Ashbourne did not process public reversal quietly. Within 20 minutes of the governor's order, she had her legal team on a conference call and had identified 3 separate grounds for a civil complaint against Nolan Reid: economic interference, disruption of a public works event, and misrepresentation of professional credentials. The claim was that Nolan, acting outside the scope of his inspection contract, had submitted alarmist data to a state agency with the intent of causing commercial damage. Her attorneys drafted the initial filing in under an hour, and Miles Caro, the group's chief financial officer, calculated that every 24 hours the bridge remained closed would cost the company between $2 and $4 million in penalties, lost toll revenue commitments, and investor relations damage. The legal threat was not a bluff. It was a pressure instrument designed to make Nolan reconsider what he had started. Preston pushed further. In a short internal memorandum distributed to the board, he suggested that the most efficient resolution to the crisis was to establish Nolan as the source of the anomaly rather than its discoverer. He noted, carefully, that Nolan's personal inspection device had been physically connected to the bridge's data infrastructure for approximately 12 minutes on the morning in question, and that this created a plausible sequence suggesting the sensor irregularities had been introduced rather than found. He framed this not as an accusation, but as a possibility worth exploring before the press found its own narrative. Victoria read the memorandum, and for a moment she did not correct him. Nolan was called back to the site, not by security, and not with an apology. He was told the company wished to give him an opportunity to address the allegations before legal proceedings began. He drove back to the same conference room, this time with his full professional record open on his tablet. Victoria began the meeting by saying she believed he had manufactured the crisis to rehabilitate a reputation damaged by his exit from the industry 6 years earlier. Nolan said nothing. He turned the tablet toward her and let her read. The record showed that before his years as a contract inspector, Nolan Reid had served as a principal structural analyst for the Federal Infrastructure Safety Commission, where he had led the technical investigation of 4 major bridge failures, and testified before a Senate subcommittee on material substitution fraud. He had not been fired. He had not failed. He had declined to sign a safety certification for a project that used non-compliant bearing components, and the consortium behind that project had quietly circulated his name to every major construction firm in the country. He had gone from leading federal investigations to driving a cracked windshield truck because he had refused to put his name on something that would have put the public at risk. Victoria kept reading, and the detail that landed hardest was this. The consortium Nolan had refused to certify 6 years earlier had included a materials firm whose principals were still close contacts of Preston Kincaid. Preston's expression did not change, but something behind it did. Victoria asked Nolan to demonstrate that the bridge presented genuine danger rather than relying on his credentials. He agreed and set one condition, that all project data be immediately secured and transferred to an independent state repository, and that Preston Kincaid have no access to the server during the review period. She looked at Preston. Preston said nothing. She turned back to Nolan and accepted the condition because the cost of keeping the bridge closed was rising faster than her willingness to trust a man who had just run out of answers. The forgery emerged from a routine metadata check. Nolan had been reviewing the project's compliance annexes when he noticed an appendix bearing his digital signature, a document certifying that the Eastern Anchor Cluster had passed structural verification and was cleared for full vehicle load. The file's creation timestamp showed it had been generated 3 days before the dedication ceremony. The problem was immediate. Nolan's inspection contract explicitly limited his authorization to surface condition assessment, and he had never been granted access to the project's compliance system. Someone had extracted his credential hash from an earlier document submission and embedded it into a new file. The forgery was clean enough to pass a surface check, but it collapsed under metadata examination because the signing timestamp did not match any session in which his device had been authenticated to the project's server. He set that file aside and moved to the anchor rods. The lot numbers stamped into the installed rods were matched against the procurement database, and the result confirmed what his field inspection had already suggested. The approved vendor documentation listed a Pennsylvania mill certified for high cycle fatigue resistance, but the rod markings in the field corresponded to a different manufacturer, a smaller operation that had formally dissolved its business 2 years earlier. The rods were not counterfeit in the sense of being physically deceptive. They were simply the wrong specification. They had been purchased at a cost nearly 30% below the approved material, with a fatigue tolerance that sat measurably below what the bridge's dynamic load model required. The difference would not matter in a static test under moderate load. It would matter under the cyclic stress of daily traffic across years. Miles Caro arrived at the site office while Nolan was still working through the procurement records. He closed the door behind him, sat across the table, and spoke in a tone designed to suggest that what he was about to say was reasonable. He explained that the company was prepared to offer Nolan a consulting retainer in exchange for a supplemental report, concluding that the sensor anomalies had been resolved through calibration adjustments, and that the bridge met all operational standards. He named a number. Nolan looked at the figure on the paper. Miles slid across the table, then looked back at Miles and said that the people who would drive across that bridge every morning did not know the difference between a rod rated for high cycle fatigue and one rated for standard static load. They crossed because they believed the certification meant something. He was not interested in being paid to make the certification mean less. Miles left without the agreement he had come for. Victoria had been in the adjoining room during the exchange and had heard enough. She did not intervene while it was happening. She told Nolan instead that there had to be a way to address the structural concerns without triggering a disclosure that would cost hundreds of workers their contracts. Nolan told her that engineering did not have a public relations division and that the only path forward was an accurate one, not unkindly, but without softening it. That evening, Lena Brooks found Nolan at his truck in the service lot. She was a data analyst on Preston's team, 29 years old, and she had spent most of the past month trying to decide whether silence was cowardice or self-preservation. She told him that the warning thresholds on the monitoring dashboard had been adjusted upward at Preston's instruction, and that 3 load test displacement events from the commissioning phase had been separated from the main report and filed as standalone calibration notes to prevent them from triggering a cumulative risk flag. She had kept a backup copy of the original data on an external drive, and she handed it to him without ceremony. He asked her if she understood what giving him that drive would mean for her career. She said she had thought about it for 6 weeks, and she was more afraid of what it would mean if she did not. Governor Whitmore announced the following morning that the bridge would remain closed pending an independent structural review, with no timeline for reopening. The political consequences arrived within hours. The mayor of the city the bridge was meant to serve called the closure economically irresponsible. Freight companies with contracts tied to the bridge's opening threatened to invoke penalty clauses. 3 members of the State Transportation Committee drafted a public letter demanding a faster resolution and questioning whether the closure order had been based on sufficient evidence. The pressure was not abstract. It had names, dollar amounts, and news cycles attached to it, and it landed squarely on the governor's desk alongside the technical reports Nolan and Dana had produced. Nolan was given 18 hours to demonstrate, using reproducible methodology, that the anchor cluster displacement was not an instrument artifact, but a real structural event with a measurable progression rate. He began with Lena's recovered data, which showed 3 commissioning phase displacement events that had occurred across the 6-week period before the dedication ceremony. The events had been small individually, but their pattern was not random. Each subsequent event was slightly larger than the previous one, and each occurred under conditions of elevated temperature combined with asymmetric vehicle load on the eastern lanes. Nolan and Dana rebuilt the load sequence together, using the commissioning data to construct a progression model that could then be tested against the current sensor readings. The model predicted the next displacement event within a measurable margin. The sensors confirmed it. The mechanism was not difficult to explain, though it had been deliberately buried under separated reports. The substandard anchor rods had a lower resistance to elastic deformation than specified, meaning they stretched further under the same load. Because the eastern cluster carried slightly more dead weight than the western side, due to a minor grade asymmetry in the approach, the eastern rods had already accumulated a disproportionate share of the cyclic stress during commissioning. The displacement events were the anchor plate responding to micro-slip accumulation at the rod-to-socket interface. A bridge with the correct rods would have distributed that stress without detectable movement. The bridge, as built, was moving. Preston did not wait for Nolan to finish. He held a press availability outside the site office and described Nolan to 3 television cameras as a cautionary example of what happened when grievance was allowed to masquerade as expertise. He spoke about Nolan's years working small inspection contracts, implied that the absence of a permanent institutional affiliation reflected a pattern of professional difficulty rather than principled choice, and mentioned with apparent sympathy that raising a child alone on contract income was a situation that could cause anyone to seek a larger stage. It was a precise and practiced performance, and it landed in the early evening news cycle with enough force to generate a second round of calls to the governor's office, questioning the evidentiary basis for the closure. Nolan watched the broadcast on his phone in the state transportation office, then turned the screen off and called Sadie, who was staying with a neighbor during the week. The call lasted less than 4 minutes. He told her the work was taking longer than expected, that he would be home by the weekend, and that she should not worry about anything she might see on the news, and she said she already knew because someone at school had sent her a link, and she wanted to know if he was okay, and he said he was. After he hung up, he sat for a moment with the phone in his hand, and then he went back to work. Victoria spent that same evening requesting the original unfiltered data from Preston directly, rather than through the company dashboard, and Preston told her the raw files were stored in a format requiring proprietary analysis software, and that the board's technical committee would need to authorize the export before she could access them. It was the first time in their working relationship that Preston Kincaid had told Victoria Ashbourne what she needed permission to see. The emergency hearing was held in the main chamber of the state government building, attended by more people than the room was designed to hold. Press cameras lined the back wall. Investor representatives sat in a reserved section to the left of the public gallery. The board of Ashbourne Infrastructure was present in a row behind the company's legal counsel, and Dana Pike represented the state at one table, while Nolan Reed sat at another with a single folder and a set of physical samples he had requested permission to bring. Governor Whitmore presided, not as a participant, but as the authority through whom the day's outcome would be enforced. Preston presented first. His presentation ran 40 minutes and was built around a series of high-resolution charts that required familiarity with structural engineering nomenclature to interpret, which was precisely the point. He described Nolan as a contract inspector with no supervisory standing on the project who had exceeded his authorization by interfacing with the bridge's primary sensor infrastructure. He displayed a server access log showing that a device registered to Nolan had connected to the bridge's monitoring network at 7:42 in the morning, approximately 11 minutes before the first anomalous readings appeared in the state database, and he suggested, without stating it as a conclusion, that the sequence of events was worth careful consideration. Victoria watched the access log appear on the screen and found herself studying Nolan's expression to determine whether the alarm she felt was warranted. Nolan had no charts. He placed 3 steel rod samples on the table in front of the panel, one from the approved specification, one from the installed lot, and one cut from a test bar of the intermediate grade, and he described the difference between them using an analogy the room could follow without engineering training. The installed rods behaved the way a coil spring of the wrong gauge would behave inside a precision instrument, where the movement was small, but the tolerance the system was designed around did not exist to be approximate. He then addressed the access log directly, confirming he had connected his inspection device to the monitoring network at 7:42. And showing the authorization certificate issued by the state contracting office that explicitly permitted read-only access to the bridge monitoring feed as part of his inspection scope. He pulled the full access log, not the version Preston had presented, which showed that his device had been issued observer-level credentials with no write permission and no configuration access, and the log Preston had displayed had been printed without the permission tier column, showing that the connection occurred while concealing that the connection could not have altered anything. He then presented the compiled evidence in sequence, the material lot substitution confirmed against procurement records, the forged appendix bearing his credential hash with a creation timestamp traceable to a workstation on the project's internal network, the threshold elevation in the monitoring dashboard tied to an administrator account registered under Preston's credentials, 3 commissioning load test events logged separately to prevent cumulative risk classification, and a forensic accounting summary showing a procurement payment differential of approximately $9 million routed through an intermediate vendor whose principals included a holding company linked to Miles Caro. Preston interrupted to say that Victoria had personally authorized the accelerated project timeline that had created the conditions for these decisions to be made below her level of visibility. He was correct, and Nolan did not dispute it, confirming that Victoria Ashbourne had signed an acceleration directive whose annexes she had not reviewed in detail, and that this constituted a significant supervisory failure. Victoria understood, as the room did, that Preston had just attempted to use her signature as a wall between himself and the evidence Nolan had placed on the table. She stood up before Preston could add anything further, and told the panel that the bridge would remain closed until an independent engineering body had cleared the structure for public use. It was not a pivot. It was the only direction that remained available to her. The audio file arrived through Preston's attorney during the brief recess, presented as evidence of extortion. In the recording, a voice bearing identifiable characteristics of Nolan Reed's speech pattern could be heard saying that he was willing to make the problem go away, that he understood the value of what was at stake, and that a number could be arrived at. Preston's attorney argued before the full panel that this recording established Nolan's true motivation for the inspection findings. Not public safety, but leverage. The room shifted, and several board members who had been watching neutrally turned to study Nolan's reaction. Nolan requested that the full recording be played rather than the 90-second segment submitted as evidence. He stated that he knew precisely which conversation had been recorded, when it had occurred, and what the full transcript contained. The panel granted the request over Preston's attorney's objection, and the playback revealed that the 90-second segment was drawn from a conversation that ran 11 minutes. In the complete recording, Nolan was responding to an offer Miles Caro had made, the same offer Miles had delivered in person the previous day. The words that had been isolated to suggest a demand for payment were, in context, Nolan's deliberate repetition of Miles's own proposal, spoken back to confirm that he had understood the offer correctly before declining it. The phrase that sounded like extortion was a restatement made for the purpose of establishing a clear record. Nolan had known the conversation was likely being monitored and had made his refusal explicit enough to survive playback. Lena Brooks gave her testimony from the witness table without notes. She described the instruction she had received from Preston to raise the monitoring dashboard thresholds, the specific figures she had been given, and the email chain in which the instruction was documented in terms that left no ambiguity about its intent. She had been asked to ensure that the cumulative displacement readings did not trigger the system's automated alert protocol before the dedication ceremony. She had complied because she was 29 years old, her student loans were not yet paid off, and she had watched what had happened to Nolan Reed's career when he refused a similar choice in a different form. She said she had spent 6 weeks deciding whether that was an explanation or an excuse, and that she had concluded it was both, which meant it was insufficient. Dana Pike confirmed that the state server's timestamp for Nolan's warning report predated Victoria Ashbourne's termination of his contract by 31 minutes. This demolished the claim that Nolan had fabricated findings in response to being dismissed. His findings had been on record before the dismissal occurred. Miles's attorneys attempted to separate their client from Preston's actions, arguing that the chief financial officer's role in vendor selection was a standard administrative function that did not require knowledge of technical specifications. But the forensic accounting summary made this difficult to sustain. The payments had moved through accounts Miles had personally authorized, on a schedule that tracked the construction phase during which the material substitution had occurred. He had known what he was paying for. He had known it cost less than what had been approved. He had known where the difference went. The Ashbourne board convened in a side room during the second recess and returned with a proposal to allow an internal audit team to complete a findings review before any public disclosure was finalized. And Victoria sat at the table and listened to this proposal and understood that it meant handing Nolan something small and walking away with the company's reputation intact. She looked at the torn warning report that had been submitted into the hearing record as Exhibit 4. She told the board representative that she would not be doing that. Victoria found Nolan at the Eastern Anchor Cluster at dusk. There were no cameras on the service road, no board members, no attorneys. She stood a few feet from him while he studied the displacement readings on a portable monitor and said that she had been wrong about him, wrong about the report, and wrong about what she had chosen to prioritize on the morning the report landed in front of her. She did not ask him to accept the apology. She asked him to come back. Nolan told her he would return under 3 conditions. The first was that the safety team on any Ashbourne project would hold the authority to suspend operations without requiring executive approval if they documented a credible risk. The second was that Lena Brooks and anyone else who had provided testimony would be retained and protected from any form of professional retaliation, formal or informal. The third was that all structural clearances going forward would require independent third-party certification before the company's own seal was applied. Victoria agreed to all 3 without modification, not because they were easy conditions to accept, but because the bridge was still moving and she needed someone who knew how to make it stop. The repair strategy Nolan developed was precise enough to require explaining to the assembled engineering crew across 3 separate briefings before any equipment was moved. The Eastern Anchor Cluster needed to be partially offloaded using a hydraulic jacking system arranged around the cluster's perimeter, while temporary support cables were tensioned to redistribute the dead load away from the compromised rods during the replacement process. The sequencing was critical. Each jacking point had to reach its target load within a narrow tolerance window before the adjacent point was activated, because out-of-sequence loading would shift the lateral force the anchor plate was already experiencing into the surrounding concrete rather than into the temporary support system. The crew that had built the bridge to the wrong specification now had to hold it precisely still while the correct components were installed. Nobody laughed in any of the briefings. The engineers who had been in the conference room the morning Nolan was dismissed now checked their own calculations twice before signing off on any measurement. And he did not reference the earlier dismissal, did not point out who had believed what, and did not accept any special deference in the way questions were directed toward him. He asked for accuracy and he got it. Victoria remained on the construction side of the perimeter for the full duration of the operation, declining 3 calls from board members and canceling a scheduled investor relations appearance without explanation. Near the end of the second day's work, one of the perimeter sensors registered a load spike that sent a pulse of alarm through the crew. And 2 technicians moved toward the emergency release, and Nolan told them to stop, not sharply, but with a certainty that froze the room. He read the oscillation pattern on the portable monitor for 15 seconds, then said the spike was the load redistributing into the temporary cable system exactly as the model had predicted. It was not a failure event, it was the system working. The crew held their positions. The oscillation subsided. The displacement readings in the eastern anchor zone fell back within the original design tolerances for the first time since commissioning, and the anchor plate was still. And when the final verification sensor returned a stable reading across all 4 quadrants simultaneously, nobody cheered. They were too tired, and too aware of how close the outcome had been in the other direction. Governor Whitmore released the preliminary findings at a press conference 3 days later. The closure order had been issued in response to a credible, independently verified structural risk, and the warning submitted by Nolan Reed had been the direct and sufficient basis for the regulatory action that had prevented a serious public safety incident. Preston Kincaid and Miles Caro had been referred to the State Attorney General's office for investigation into procurement fraud, falsification of safety documentation, unauthorized modification of monitoring systems, and misappropriation of public contract funds. The referral did not predetermine the outcome of a prosecution, but it meant the matter was no longer in the company's hands. The Ashbourne board moved quickly toward a vote to remove Victoria as chief executive officer. She did not resist the attempt immediately. She spent a day reviewing the options available to her and arrived at the board meeting the following morning with an offer the board had not expected. She would forego the dedication event bonus specified in her contract, authorize the release of the full procurement and compliance audit to the State Oversight Office, with no redactions, invite an independent governance monitor to oversee the company's project approval process for a period of no less than 3 years, and appear before the investor community to take direct responsibility for the management failures that had allowed the substitution and forgery to proceed under her authority, without attributing those failures to the personnel who had executed them. The board did not remove her. The combination of her disclosures and her willingness to stand in front of the damage rather than behind it made her replacement more legally complicated than her retention. She had made herself into a witness as much as an executive, and witnesses had a different kind of value in what was coming. The full company meeting happened the following week. Victoria stood at the front of the room with the reconstituted warning report in her hands. The two halves had been taped back together and placed in a document sleeve, and she set it on the table so the room could see it. She told the engineers, analysts, site managers, and administrative staff that the decision she had made in that conference room had not been the result of being deceived by Preston Kincaid, though she had been deceived. It had been the result of a habit of weighing the credibility of a warning by the institutional standing of the person delivering it, rather than by the content of what was being said. She said that habit was expensive in ways that could not be recovered by a bonus or a launch ceremony. She then read aloud the 3 conditions Nolan had set before agreeing to return to the site, and announced that they were being codified as standing policy. Nolan declined the vice president title she offered. He accepted a role as director of an independent safety division, with reporting lines running to the board's external audit committee rather than to the chief executive officer's office. The title was smaller. The authority was absolute. 6 weeks later, the Ashbourne Crown Bridge reopened. Every anchor rod in the eastern cluster had been replaced with components from the originally specified mill, verified through third-party metallurgical testing before installation. The monitoring system had been rebuilt with threshold parameters set by the State Engineering Office, not by the company. An independent inspection team had signed the clearance report. The clearance process had taken longer than the original construction schedule had estimated for the ceremony itself, and nobody involved expressed any opinion about that. There was no ribbon, there was no stage, there was no catered breakfast on white-draped tables. The opening convoy was a line of ordinary vehicles, utility trucks, commuter cars, a school bus running behind its usual morning schedule, that moved across the bridge on a Tuesday without any announcement beyond a brief notice posted to the State Transportation Office. A small group of engineers and state safety staff stood on the service road and watched the first vehicles cross, and a few of them shook hands with each other, and most of them said nothing. Inside the central monitoring room, a mounted placard had been installed on the wall above the main sensor display. It read, "Every warning deserves review, regardless of the title of the person who raised it. The placard had not been placed there by the company's communications team. It had been requested by Nolan, approved by Dana Pike, and manufactured at a fabrication shop 11 miles from the bridge at a cost Nolan paid out of his own pocket. Sadie came to the service road for the opening. She was 13 years old and wore a jacket slightly too large for her, borrowed from a hook near their front door. She stood beside her father and watched the vehicles cross the bridge he had kept closed, and a man in a hard hat she did not recognize walked over and extended his hand to Nolan. And then two more did the same, and she noticed that her father looked mildly uncomfortable with the attention in the specific way he always did when recognition came without being earned in that particular moment. She did not say anything about that. She understood it was a habit of his. Victoria appeared at the monitoring room doorway as the first full wave of traffic reached the midspan, and she handed Nolan the framed, reconstituted warning report without speaking, and he looked at it for a moment and thanked her and set it on the desk facing the door rather than in his own office, saying it belonged where the decisions were made. She asked him, as the bridge sensor display showed stable readings across every quadrant, how he had been certain enough to keep pushing when every credentialed voice in that conference room had told him he was wrong. He said he had not been certain he was right. He said he had only been certain they had not yet established that the bridge was safe. Outside, traffic moved steadily across the span whose warning had once been torn in half and dropped in the dust, and the bridge stood, and that was the only proof that had ever needed to exist.